and it's one of the brightest and one of the most distinguished panel we have had on the subject. And we are going to kind of having a very useful time, I think, in the next 2 hours. Before I hand over to Professor Kundu, let me kind of take a minute and tell you why we are doing this webinars and what we are trying to kind of achieve in the process. As most of you know, that we are hosting as many as 30 webinars on the subject of rethinking cities, and especially rethinking Indian cities. As you know very well, that cities are the future. Cities as they are need to be looked into. They huge amount of effort needs to go into rethinking the cities. And this webinar series that we're organizing is an attempt to get as many more people in the process of thinking. Idea also is to kind of take the thought process, make people aware about what the issues are, and really kind of get a larger network of people to think about cities, contribute ideas. So that is what is happening. And the reason we decided on as many as 30 webinars is this: the subject is very complex. It requires to be looked at from different angles and perspectives. And we thought that 30 webinars would probably give us an opportunity to bring in something like 100, 120 experts and specialists who could really would look into this. Government, as you know, has been doing enormous amount of work on the subject, but we also know it's not enough. So this is a supplementary, complementary effort to think about cities of today and cities of tomorrow. So having said that, I would request Professor Kundu to take over and take us for next 2 hours on this aspect of migration and what we have seen and what would it mean in the context of cities development in the next 30, 40, 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirti. Good afternoon and good evening. It's honor and privilege for me to welcome the panelists and also the participants of this webinar on a very important subject. Why should we return or go back to the cities that discarded us? And we have panelists from 3 countries, each being significant in the context of the corona pandemic for a very special reason. We have China, we have South Africa, and we have India. China, we have heard a lot about the sociology and politics of Wuhan. We'll perhaps begin with that, but would hear a lot more about the policies towards the migrants, despite having the household registration system and some modifications, and despite certain administrative and legal changes in 2003 and 2006 for the migrants, how the access to basic amenities for the rural-urban migrants were very, very weak, and how during the period of the pandemic, the State Council order came to ensure that all the migrants get their wages. I think that's from 1st of May, and I'm sure we'll get to hear a lot more on these migration-related issues in China from our first panelist, Professor Dunford, who is based in Beijing. And then I will introduce each panelist just for a minute, just before they speak. I must say that our gratitude towards INHAF, towards Professor Kirti Shah, Dr. Hariharan, Radhika, for taking care of many of the academic and administrative issues. As a student of economics, I always felt that one can look at the problems of urban development through a matrix of data and temporal analysis could be done with mathematical models. But I realized after interacting with them that the architectural window and the design perspective is extremely useful to take an alternate view of some of the problems. I must just take a couple of more minutes. I want to make my initial remark for less than 5 minutes that I allotted myself. I thought I'll just explain the word we in the theme, because my dear friend Kirti Shah talked to me before 2 days to say, shouldn't we make it more explicit to say who the we are? We, quote unquote, we know that who are the people who were discarded, who were not treated very well in the urban system, who are the people who are to leave the cities in a huff by using all kinds of modes of transport, even if you consider cycling and walking as modes of transport. Who are the people whose return to the cities are raising several issues? Are we making the cities more inclusive, more just to bring them back? But we all know that, and we did not want to really put in explicitly the word migrant because we didn't want to get into the debate of we and they and look at the migrants in the frame of the theory of others. I'll just cite 2 lines from Rudyard Kipling, who says beautifully, all good people agree and all good people say that all nice people like us, that all nice people like us are we, and everyone else is they. From my interaction with all the panelists and from my reading of their research papers and other writings, I'm very confident that all of them consider migrants to be part of we and not part of they. So I thought it is not necessary really to clarify, and we can keep we the title. I'm very happy to invite Professor Michael Dunford, professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, and he's an emeritus professor at the University of Sussex. He's the chief editor of a leading research journal, Area Development and Policy. I'm sure if I make my introduction make a little more elaborate, he will be very unhappy because it will really make his time availability a little less. So I would just stop here, make the next 9 minutes belong to you.
Can you see my screen? Can I share the screen?
Yes.
Can you see the screen? Amitabh?
Yes.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can
Yes,
see.
I can see the screen. Yes. Absolutely,
Okay.
no problem. Go ahead.
I want to say something about the relationship between migration, urbanization, economic growth, and poverty alleviation. Okay. The question is, should migrants return to the cities that, in India on the eve of the pandemic treated them rather badly? I mean, clearly the answer is that they themselves should decide. They should decide in the light of their circumstances and, of course, in the light of the conditions that they're provided with in the cities to which they migrate. But what is absolutely clear is that urbanization itself and the movement of rural people to cities and movement of people from agriculture to industry are major drivers of economic growth. And they're also major drivers of poverty alleviation, as I shall explain in a while. If you look at the case of China, basically in the recent past, every year there were about 160 to 180 million rural migrant workers. There were other migrant workers, but not rural migrant workers. in China, there was an annual cycle because people would go home for the Chinese New Year. And then after the Chinese New Year, which they spent with their families, they would return to the cities. When they returned to the cities, you can see from this chart here that the earnings, that they obtained were 3 times average rural income. So in a financial sense, moving to the cities was something that was extremely beneficial to them and plays a major role in their movement to those cities. And it's interesting actually that this year, after the Chinese New Year, the number of rural people leaving the poverty counties in China to return to work in cities was actually larger than last year, which is actually quite striking in the light of the COVID epidemic. These movements are in part a reflection, of course, of the fact that earnings are much higher in cities than in the countryside, and actually permanent movements to the city are therefore encouraged in the sense that they lead to increases in income. But what's also very striking is that the earnings that these migrant workers earn constitute a very large share of rural household incomes, whether it be in poor counties or in other parts of rural China. In the recent past, there have been major changes in the geography of mobility in China. I mean, these 2 charts depict the situation in 2005 and 2015, but basically, I explain with the next slide. Basically, if you take the case of Beijing, in 2005 there were 2.87 million migrants, so they're 20% of the urban population. In Wuhan, at that stage, they were just 10%. By 2015, in Wuhan, they were 20.25%. Now, that's in part a reflection of shifts in the geography of industry in China, with the movement of industries inland and away from the coastal zones. So the places to which migrants go have become, in a sense, less concentrated in the coastal cities and more spread out. And obviously there is a very strong encouragement to move to places other than the first-tier cities. And these shifts are to some extent associated with changes in the household registration system. I have a note here about Wenzhou, because actually, I won't talk about the geography of COVID, but if you talk about the geography of COVID, one needs to say something about that city and the fact that many of the migrants to that city are not in fact what we normally think of as migrant workers, but entrepreneurs. COVID, of course, had a huge impact. It was thought that maybe 50 to 60 million jobs were lost in services and industry, and maybe 20 million in industry and construction. Basically, as places reopen, the economy has started to recover, and I'll refer to that in a little while. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that in recent years, many of the informal jobs that existed in some of China's mega cities in particular have tended to disappear, and actually the number of informal workers has diminished. This is just a slide that looks at the situation in the countryside, and for reasons of time, I'm not going to dwell on it. Reflects the situation in the places that people come from. But what I want to emphasize is that addressing the problem of migrants in large cities is not just a matter of addressing the problems of the cities themselves. What one actually has to do in rethinking the role of cities is to think about the process of rural-urban integration. And in China, from about 2008, this question of rural-urban integration became a fundamental or key issue, driving thinking about the role of migrants, but also thinking more generally about economic and urban and rural development. This process in China involves a whole series of policies addressing different issues. So it involves, for example, the conversion of rural households into urban households, which means hukou reform. It involves investment in public housing.
Not audible at all.
Pardon?
Everyone is shouting, is not audible at all.
Okay. Can you hear now?
Radhika is not audible. Everyone is shouting.
Really?
Yes, sir, it's not audible. If possible, sir, if you can use the headphones.
Okay.
And also if you can make your screen full screen, your presentation, or you want to make it.
I'll have to change the speaker.
Professor, will have to be slightly louder. We are not able to, we are not able, the people are not able to hear you. Can you be slightly louder?
Okay, can you hear now?
This is better. This is certainly better.
Okay.
And
So,
even if it takes little time, if you want to go back a bit, and because
don't worry.
just about everyone has missed it.
Really? Okay. If I just summarize what I said, okay?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
I
this is very
said,
good.
I said first, urbanization is a major driver of economic growth. The
Yes.
movement of people from country to the city and from agriculture to industry is a major driver of growth. I spoke about how in China, 160 to 180 million migrant workers each year after the Chinese New Year return to cities in order to work as migrant workers. And I pointed out that when they move there, the incomes that they earn are something like 3 times the average rural income. And I went on to point out that what they earn there constitutes a very large share, often 50% or more, of rural household income in different rural areas. I then pointed out that the places to which they go have changed as a result of shifts in the geography of development within China. These destinations have changed to some extent away from the coast, and that there's a lot stronger encouragement to move to smaller and medium-sized cities as a result of hukou reform. I then spoke about the way in which COVID had impacted on jobs in services, industry, and construction. And then I started to say that to address the urban issue, what one has to address is not simply what is happening in cities, but increasingly the whole question of rural-urban integration from China. In China, from 2008, rural-urban integration became a central issue of policy. And a whole series of different policies were developed and coordinated in order to manage the relationship, the changing relationship between the country and the city. It involved the conversion of rural households into urban, which involved hukou reform. It involved investment in public housing, investment in dormitories, investment in infrastructure in cities, but also in the countryside. It involved the transfer of industrial activity. So there was significant industrial transfer inland and westward, from the coastal cities. It involved, of course, always the conversion of rural land, but because China lacks arable land, it also involved attempts to recover land for agriculture in the countryside insofar as people moved to the cities. It involved the conversion of land from rural to urban uses and the use of the increment in value in order to finance the construction of infrastructure and the provision of services for those people who move to the cities. And it also involved active processes of rural regeneration, right, in order to expand food production for the cities, also in order to address poverty alleviation in the countryside. So you had a whole series of measures addressing each of these different areas, right, designed essentially to coordinate the development of cities and rural areas. And to some extent, it also was associated with shifts in the priority attached to cities of different sizes. This process of urbanization and rural-urban integration has also played a vital role in poverty alleviation. I mean, the map on the right simply plots China's poverty counties in 2017, actually, although it's now reduced to 52. And you can see the extraordinary decline in the share of the population that falls beneath different poverty lines. And the target is that at the end of this year, not one single Chinese household should lie beneath the Chinese poverty line. And in spite of COVID, there is a good probability that it will get very close, if not reach, that particular target. This program involves rural regeneration, but it actually involves a whole series of different measures, which also include supporting measures which enable people to move to cities and become urban residents. So you have measures for industrial support, right, to develop higher value farm products, to develop rural industries, to develop rural tourism, microcredit, infrastructure provision, improved housing, training and employment, partly to facilitate rural-urban transition, relocation. The figure on the right is a case of a relocation of a minority population in Sichuan. It involves,
summarize in 1 minute more, right?
okay, sure, yeah, virtually. It involves payment-free ecosystem services, education and medical assistance, solar energy projects, minimum income support, and it also involves moving people from the countryside to urban areas. Now, in China, to some extent, I mean, the COVID arrived, of course, in this world. And the chart on the right depicts the ways in which different countries have handled COVID. And it's very, very striking that in the Chinese case, which is that red line at the bottom, you can see that COVID rose rapidly and then declined and was brought under control extremely quickly. You can see the curves there also for the United States, for India, Brazil, Pakistan, a number of other countries. As a consequence of that, you know, China was able very quickly to recover, you know, from the COVID crisis. And that's one of the reasons why you see these growth projections which come from the IMF for China and for a number of other parts of the world. You can see that last year, you know, the International Monetary Fund thought that China in 2020 and 2021 would count for 28.2% of world growth. It now thinks it will account for 51.2% of world growth. It actually also thinks that India will count for 19%. So this is actually very important, because this capacity to recover economically is going to play a major role in shaping what happens to rural urban migrants and to the development of cities in these countries that are able to recover quickly, hopefully from the COVID crisis itself. This slide simply tries to explain why China was so effective in dealing with COVID, and I shall skip it and I just finish by saying thank you very much. With these series of slides, which were all taken in poor areas in China.
Thank you, Mick, for this excellent and lucid presentation highlighting the key issues underlying rural-urban migration and what we knew as floating population in China, and the difficulties in accessing the basic amenities and some of the problems which came up, really revealing the structural deficiencies. COVID really sharply brought them up, and I'm sure some of the issues will have relevance in the context of other developing countries, particularly India. May I now request Dr. Ivan Turok, Executive Director of Human Sciences Research Council, is Honorary Professor at the University of Glasgow. And by the way, would be happy to know that the city of Durban has a planning commission, which currently we do not have, but this is at the city level, and he is chairing that planning commission. May I invite Dr. Ivan Turok? I mean, I just don't want to get into the list of his publications or work. You can all look at that in the internet, but I would like to give maximum time to him. 8 minutes. Ivan, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Amitabh, and thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. It's a great pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more and learning more about India. The story could not be more different. I'm going to talk about South Africa. The story couldn't be more different from what we've heard in China. The crisis has exposed the weaknesses in our state in a very, very dramatic way. We're at a much earlier point in the curve. We are currently we have the fifth highest number of infections in the world, and the curve is rising exponentially. It's a very worrying situation. Our hospitals in many parts of the country are overburdened and struggling. The economy is in meltdown, and people are very frightened and scared. Our government does not have the resources to support households, to support business in the way they're doing in many other parts of the world. So there are very serious concerns. One of the big differences I'm going to mention from India is that the government allowed people to move when the lockdown was first announced. The government gave people 5 days to move back if they wanted to where they came from, and they kept the public transport systems operating to enable people. So that led to it's been estimated 5 and 6 million roughly 1 in 7 adults moved during that period and in subsequent, about 6 weeks later, when the full lockdown was lifted, the government again enabled people to move, they presume, back to places of work. These were people who kept their jobs where businesses shut down temporarily, the mines shut down temporarily. When they reopened, people were allowed to move back to where they lived. So that's an important difference from India. Our context is quite different from, well, let me say just a few words of context. We're 70% urbanized, so much double the urbanization of India. Cities growing at between 2 and 3% per annum. So not as rapid as many parts of the world, but still significant. The urbanization, unlike in China, we heard people, incomes 3 times higher. In South Africa, people who migrate are generally better off. We've got strong evidence of that, but not dramatically better off. Incomes are higher, but not 3 times, marginally better off. There are more jobs in the cities, but they're not particularly well paid. And many of them at the bottom end are insecure. And so people better off, but they sacrifice their living conditions when they move to the cities. Housing and basic services are inferior in informal settlements than they are in rural areas. So let me say something about the crisis then. It has impacted massively on employment. We don't have good data, but a sample survey published last week revealed that between 20 and 30% of jobs have been lost in the first 2 months of the lockdown, which is a dramatic impact on employment. Hopefully, of course, some of these jobs will rebound and are rebounding, but other evidence suggests that this is going to be a very slow and difficult recovery. There has support for people who've lost jobs. The system has been very slow to pay people unemployment insurance, and other grants are not available for people, adults of working age. Most of the social grants are available for children and for pensioners, not for adults of working age. So as a result of this, there is already a high level of dependency of people who aren't in work on those that happen to have a job. In many communities, it's been estimated that each person with a job has 7 people dependent on them for an income. So when those people lose their jobs, the consequences are very serious. Now, one consequence of the precarious nature of urban employment and of the poor quality of urban living conditions is that many people retain a kind of double life. They retain a foothold in the rural area in order to both act as a safety net for when conditions get difficult, but also as a place of retirement. So although they're pretty settled in the cities, they retain this connection. And this connection has become very important in the last few months. As I mentioned, significant numbers of people have moved back to rural areas because of the cost of living in the cities, that the cost of housing in particular, they couldn't afford to pay the rent. And so they've moved back to their rural communities where they have household members who can look after them to some extent. But a key point I want to make is that it's not been mentioned in the brief for this seminar, is that this has placed a considerable strain on rural households, a strain of having an additional member to look after, and the double strain of the loss of the remittances that again we heard about in China. So they're taught a double whammy from the decline of employment in the cities. So this strain on households is a very significant issue now. The evidence is that more people are going hungry and more people are running out of money to buy food in survey evidence. So there are essentially 3 groups of migrants that the evidence suggests, 3 main groups. The first are students. again, it hasn't been mentioned so far. There was a lot of students moving back to their families when universities and colleges were closed and residences were closed.
Ivan,
so that is
a minutes. Okay.
Sure. That's just a temporary phenomenon. Hopefully universities and colleges will reopen and students will move back. It's not a particularly economic thing. The second are these circular migrants that have moved temporarily while their place of work closed down. And again, the evidence is that when places of work reopen, those that shut down temporarily, like the mines, they move back without too much trouble. But the big issue, of course, is the people who've lost their jobs and have moved to rural areas because the cost of living is lower and because they stand a chance, they think of making some other alternative livelihood in rural areas, from growing food or from creating small trading enterprises. And this is the big uncertainty for the future. What will happen to these people? Anecdotally, we hear evidence, we hear stories of people who think they'll be better off because they don't think they'll be able to get another job in the cities for the foreseeable future. So they are trying to find a way of getting a livelihood in the rural area. And that, of course, is very, very difficult for them. It depends, their decisions in the future depends obviously on what happens to the employment situation over the period ahead. And as I mentioned, it's going to be a slow recovery. So I think the extent to which people return will be slow and many people will remain in rural areas just because they won't be able to afford to live in the cities again. The second factor that's very important is what the government does in terms of welfare support for people. There's a huge debate, of course, as to whether the government should introduce something like a basic income grant to sustain people who haven't got a job. And that will, again, will keep people in rural areas. And the final thing, of course, is what happens to the quality of life in the cities. Because conditions are poor, people make a sacrifice when they move into the city, living in a shack, and their future views of the city will depend on government investment. And again, there's now a lot of pressure on government to increase investment in basic infrastructure and in affordable housing in the cities to make these places more attractive and more viable for poor people whose only chances of getting a job lie in the cities. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ivan. It's always a pleasure listening to you. You underlined the issue of rural-urban inequality, which is sharpened in South Africa, as was mentioned by Mick also in the Chinese context, and that's the case in India as well. You talked about urban migrants being slightly better off. The National Sample Survey data in India also shows that the migrants, particularly the interstate migrants, are certainly having a higher level of consumption expenditure, better professional skills, and also in terms of access to basic amenities, they're slightly better off than the non-migrants in the large cities. But these issues will come up in the discussion. I don't want to really delay the procedure further. I would now bring one of our very senior administrators with experience of participating in policymaking in India, as well as outside that, and also a senior academic, is the Chief Executive Officer of the World Resources Institute, Dr. O.P. Agarwal. He was formerly the Director of Indian School of Business, and he was chairing the US Transport Research Board's Committee for Developing Countries. Dr. Agarwal, please have your time limited to 8 minutes or maximum 1 more minute, 9 minutes. Dr. Agarwal, please.
Thanks, Amitabh, and hello, everybody. I don't think I'll take 8 minutes also. I'll probably finish before that. We had both from Nick and from Ivan a very good kind of, data-based analysis of what is happening. I'll probably go to the other extreme and try and talk about this a little more from a public policymaker's perspective, and trying to answer your question or the question of this webinar on why should we go back to the cities? The cities that discarded us, why should we go back to that? I'll try to address that. I think, the basic message I want to convey, and this is unfortunately what many cities have wrongly done, is created an image that they are doing a favor for these people who have come to work in the cities. I think there is no favor being done to anyone. I think both sides benefit. The people who've come here to work are getting employment, and the city is benefiting because it is benefiting from the economic contributions that they make. So there's really no favor to anyone. A lot of states in India have tried to come up with policies promoting local people from doing this. But the reason migration is taking place is there is clearly an imbalance. There is an imbalance, there is a need in one state, there is a surplus in another state, and that's how the migration happens. So there's really no favor being done by one group to the other group. Some of the evidence that, I haven't come across any structured survey being done, but some of the evidence that is coming out from people talking to those who've gone back, and in fact, there's one article by a colleague of mine in today's Indian Express, where he spoke to a few people who came back from Tirupur, all the way in Tirupur in Tamil Nadu to Bihar. And they said, we used to get an income of 900 rupees in Tirupur. We get only 500 rupees here. They're looking for that extra income. Today, they're not able to go back. They're a little scared to go back, but they have this aspiration to go back to a higher level of income. So that is one of the things that may persuade them to go back. It was absolutely tragic. I would say there can't be a harsher word, but absolutely tragic that at a time when the lockdown was imposed, people were not even able to go back to the villages. They didn't have food here, they didn't have work here, yet they could not even go back to the place which is the normal place you would want to go back where you're in trouble, that is go back home. They couldn't do that. But I don't, the way I look at it is, I don't think anyone here had information about the extent of migrant labor and the fact that this would be a natural urge for most of them. When policymakers were caught up with trying to deal with the pandemic, I don't think this even struck them. And that's why the whole idea of stopping the transport systems was to prevent the spread of the pandemic. But unfortunately, the negative fallout was a really cruel treatment of people who wanted to go back. That was, in my view, extremely, extremely unfortunate. Now, coming to what policy should do, I think it's very important that you take care of them. Take care of them in some way that is fair to them and good to them. We have to do that. What is it that policy can possibly do? In my mind, the first thing is stop using the term migrant labor. I think let's have a slightly more dignified term that we use for them. Somewhere I read something about, guest workers. I think that's a lot more dignified. These are really guests, and being workers, they are really contributing to our economy. I think one is that public perception of migrant labor, use a different term, say a guest worker, sounds a lot better. Second is a lot of the social security or a lot of the benefits that people get, I think they should now become a national benefit. So if they have moved to a city in some form, whether it's a healthcare benefit or whether it's electoral rights or whatever else, can these be made transferable across the city? To my mind, in today's age, this should not be a problem at all. This just needs a will to be able to do it. That's something that needs to be done. I think what I would call is, this is a kind of a unified social security system that is across the country and should not depend on where people are at that point of time. One huge problem that they face is the kind of living conditions, living in those slums where they have to pay a huge amount. And once they've paid that huge amount, it's a kind of investment that they've made. Then moving out from that becomes very difficult. Some kind of a affordable rental housing scheme that really needs to come up. And I understand the government of India has put something like that together. They are going in for some kind of PPP-based rental housing program. It's just apparently been rolled out. I don't know how this will take off, what actions will happen, but I think it's a step in the right direction. So that's the other thing that should be done, and I think the action is on the right path. I think the third is about creating employment opportunities. This is really the time to think of whether certain things that we were doing in concentrated locations, can they be dispersed to some extent? And let me give you an example. One of the big problems that was faced is agricultural produce. Potatoes and tomatoes were not consumed adequately because restaurants and parties and weddings did not happen. So all of that perished because there was no demand for them, and the farmers lost out on that. Now, is there a way of having very decentralized semi-processing plants where people can get some employment, some kind of semi-processing can happen so that the shelf life of even perishables can go up to some extent? Things like this, even, garment making, weaving, handicrafts, a lot of these, there can be some kind of decentralization that take place. The problem with decentralization is, number one, training people at that in able to do those skills, and second, in the marketing of those products. I think marketing, it should not be very difficult to have arrangements by which, this decentralized production is picked up by some corporate or some entity. Fab India is a very good example of what happens. Can something like that come up so that jobs are produced, are decentralized, yet marketing and sales get concentrated in some places? I think these are the kinds of opportunities that need to be thought of so that you create some segment of the jobs closer to the villages, and a lower segment of the jobs can remain where they were. I'm sure that everything can't be decentralized, but at least if some portion can be decentralized, that will be a way of creating some opportunities for them. Amitabh, let me leave it at that. This is a very policymakers kind of perspective of what are the things that can be done. But, Mrs. Shailaja Chandra has got a lot more experience than me, and I'm sure she'll be able to add or correct what I'm trying to say. Let me leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, for putting a very interesting perspective on rural-urban migration in a way that can lead us directly into the solutions and putting forward very 3 or 4 very concrete policy recommendations, and I'm sure they will figure in the discussion. May I bring in another academic person who also, like Dr. Agarwal, represents the best of the 2 worlds. He has also participated in policy making, Professor Ravi Srivastava. We have heard about the rural-urban inequality in China and South Africa. Here is one professor who has looked at migration, rural-urban migration, from the rural context a little more, but also he has looked at the current situations. Professor Srivastava, he is currently an eminent professor at the Institute for Human Development in Delhi. He is formerly with the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he has been a member of National Commission on Unorganized Sector. Professor Ravi Srivastava, please.
Thank you, Amitabh, and thanks to Kirti and INHAF for inviting me to participate in this webinar. A lot of the general issues actually in relation to migration have been flagged by Mick. I had the fortune and the privilege of actually working quite a bit on comparing India and China and looking at migration closely in 2 sectors, in construction and garments. And maybe at some stage, I'll try to reflect on the similarities and dissimilarities between these 2 countries. One of the big dissimilarities is the lack of attention that we have paid in this country to circular migration. As far as rural-urban migration is concerned, I come into this debate as a development economist, and I think we understand that urbanization and development, rural-urban migration, urbanization and development go hand in hand. We economists understand this very well, but I think in the general perspective, the links between migration and development are not so well understood. As far as this webinar goes, I think much of the debate that we've been having in the past few weeks has been flagged by the magnitude and the precarity of the circular migration, of circular migrants that imploded before our very eyes in India in the post-pandemic period. And the responses that we saw to their urban exodus among various stakeholders. These should cause us to seriously question our dominant development paradigm, the role of the state, the role of the employers, and the manner in which circular migrants were allowed, or rather not allowed, to exercise their constitutional rights. I think the various colleagues have rightly said that we are dealing with citizens, and perhaps just the fact that we use the term migrants tends to stigmatize them. Let me say that in my own estimate, between the third week of March and June, nearly 25 to 30 million interstate circular migrant workers, along with another 15 to 20 million dependents, were involved in the largest urban exodus that India has ever seen. These numbers do not include millions of other intrastate circular migrants who also went back to their native places after lockdown was declared in India. I mean, a lot of us have been struggling to understand these magnitudes and the precarity of these migrants. I will, just for the sake of simplicity and clarity, divide migrants into three broad segments. One is long-term permanent migrants, and Mick said, well, let's not talk about them, and I agree. Then the second is the long-term circular migrants, and this, Ivan said, you know, in the South African context, people who have a foothold in the urban areas. And finally, the short-term circular or seasonal migrants, similar to the floating migrants in China, who have no foothold in the urban areas where they work. By my estimates, the numbers of long-term and short-term circular migrant workers in India have been steadily growing and increasing. I have tried to estimate the numbers of these migrants from admittedly very poor data. I mean, the poverty of migration data in India is so abysmal that I hope, you know, Amitabh has some time to talk about it later in the discussion. Currently, I estimate that there are about 130 million vulnerable circular migrant workers, out of whom 60 million were short-term circular migrant workers in India. I also estimate that there are about 52 million vulnerable interstate circular migrant workers, including 25 million short-term circular migrants. And most of these are in and around urban areas. Now, in fact, if you look at the total precarious employment outside agriculture, my estimates are that 55 to 57% of this is constituted today by circular migrants. We need to understand why has there been this enormous growth in circular migration. This has been impelled by increasing spatial polarization in India, particularly since liberalization and globalization, declining livelihood opportunities in rural areas in large parts of the countries, concentration of economic activity in and around centers of economic agglomeration, usually also large urban centers, and labor market policies pursued by the state and by employers. This growth in circular migration has also been impelled by the restructuring of the labor force in India in favor of precarious employment, in which circular migrants play a large and growing part, constituting part of a strategy of gaining global competitiveness by lowering labor costs and a race to the bottom, with employers in the state increasingly shedding their responsibility towards workers and their rights. And we can compare this over a period of time. From the workers' point of view, circular migration is an option through which they increase employment days and maximize earnings at the cost of living and working standards, something which Dr. Agarwal also pointed out. It allows workers to raise their subsistence levels in the prime of their working lives and to escape poverty and a rural poverty trap in some cases. From the perspective of these workers, there is no real choice but to eventually plan to return to places where they can find work. In the present circumstances, this return will be protracted because economic activity will take a very long time to revive, not least because the state's policy response in India has been very weak. However, I also hold the view that the migrant who will now return to the city is not the same migrant that worked in it before the pandemic. Having been shaped by the experience of the last few months, and the employers and the cities, as well as the state, will soon have to acknowledge and respond to the new reality.
Ravi, you have to conclude now.
Yes, it is at the societal level that choices exist and need to be reflected upon and considered. here there are several questions which we need to think about, and I will just end by flagging them. Number one, what is the extent of inequalities that can be tolerated and that are consistent with a sustainable growth pattern, whether it is India or globally? And what do we do about them? Secondly, what kind of cities should we live in? And here I think the issue of rural-urban interaction in an integrated strategy is very important. Third, how do we strengthen the health system, recognizing health as a public externality? And what does this mean for workplaces, housing, and so on? Fourth, how do we understand the shift that globalization has induced between capital and labor rights? How do we reimagine development paradigms which recognize the dignity of work and labor and not treat labor as a cost to be minimized? And finally, how do we locate migration in the context of human rights and citizenship rights, the lack of which we have seen so evidently in the pandemic period in India? So let me stop here.
Thank you, Ravi, for raising some of the very important and structural issues relating to the dynamics of development in India. I have failed miserably in time management. We are behind schedule by 15 minutes, so there may not be time to go into the data-related issues. But I entirely agree with you and also Mick that let's not consider migrants to be a homogeneous category. You have to have, average migrants earning and average migrants access to basic amenities is no criteria, does not provide the meaningful policy input in the periods of crisis, unless you have a criteria to separate it out, the vulnerable migrants and the poor migrants from the others. And unfortunately, the database does not permit that. But let me now bring in another very senior administrators in this country who has participated not only in policy making, but also their implementation and addressing the grievances in the process of the implementation. Ms. Shailaja Chandra, she was formerly the Secretary to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, which has become a major area of concern, the health and family welfare in the time of crisis. She was the Chief Secretary, basically the Chief Administrator of the Delhi government. She was the Executive Director of National Population Development Fund, and I think most importantly, the Chairperson of the Public Grievances Commission. May I request Ms. Chandra to take her time, 8 minutes, 8 to 9 minutes. Ms. Shailaja Chandra, please.
You're on mute. I think you're on mute.
I was audible, right? She's not.
You're audible.
Is there some problem with her connection?
Now you're fine.
Okay. Shailaja ji, is that all right? You can come in.
I think you're still muted, ma'am.
Somebody muted me. I had unmuted myself.
I can hear you now.
All right.
Okay.
So, you've taken a minute in going through all this, so I'm going to grab that minute also back. So thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much, Mr. Agarwal, Dr. Kundu. And I'm love to see all the other participants. It was wonderful hearing others because this is not a perspective we normally get as policymakers or former policymakers. Having said that, let me be as short and as crisp as possible, but see it from the lens of policy making. Policy is made because of two major factors. And the first is there a constituency, which is a political constituency, which has to be nurtured? Second is the consideration that is there a lobby which is asking for something from a certain set of circumstances. Now, in the case of migrants, it works like this. The prime movers are the employers, large employers, smaller employers, contractors, who are the kingpin who actually bring these migrants by invitation or by order, by giving them money as an inducement into the cities. it is always, it's not a decision which is always taken as at a personal level. It is done by subcontractors saying you will get this much payment if you come. Now, the question that arises is, will these migrants who have now gone away come back to India, to the cities? I think we are on the cusp right now. In case COVID can be controlled and the whatever measures of creation of antibodies and being able to treat people without their having to, I mean, really succumb, it is sort of an asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic cases, the migrants will come back, but they will have to have two things. One is a firm commitment that they are likely to be wanted for doing a job which is going to continue. It is not going to be ephemeral. Number two, they now realize that they have been deprived of the social security which their neighbors had. Those people were also migrants. I'll give you 3 examples. A man comes 35 years ago from Bundi district in Rajasthan. He comes as a man who is just cutting stones for a construction contractor. His wife starts doing the same thing. His children are born here, they start going to school. They are very much citizens of Delhi, they're citizens of India, of course. Now, having been schooled in Delhi, these people have aspirations which are much bigger than the parents had. They are already in a slum, and slowly the older generation, the chief ministers who come, would like to see them given an election card, because then they will form part of the constituency, the voter constituency. But until that happens, they're not going to be covered by the social security, which includes food rations. That realization has come very strongly, and the migrants have realized that they have been exploited. So they will definitely like to form some sort of a group which can have some leverage with the government. Because they come from disparate backgrounds and there is no homogeneity, they do not really subscribe to any caste equation, any community equation, any place of residence equation. They are not going to be accepted very easily. And to give you an example, in Maharashtra and Mumbai, you have the Maharashtra Manus syndrome. A migrant comes 22 years ago, but he does not get domiciled there because he's not a Maharashtrian. So that will come into play in many of the cities. So the migrant will not get all the things that he should be entitled to unless governments step in. Now today, the governments everywhere, but in India much more so, are totally driven by whose jurisdiction is it. Migrants are only the jurisdiction of the Labor Ministry, who are supposed to actually implement about 6 laws which deal with migrants and their protection and their compensation and their well-being. But those laws are not being implemented either by the central government or by the state governments. If those laws have to be implemented, it requires having a complete hold on the employer, which means the employer must take the responsibility of seeing that there is a modicum of housing, drinking water, health coverage. That will drive costs up. If that drives costs up, take the construction industry. If you're going to buy a flat for, say, 50 lakhs of rupees, which is, say, what shall I say, about 5 million of Indian rupees. Am I right, Dr. Kundu? 5 million?
Yep, roughly, yes.
Yeah. So if you're going to buy that flat, that cost might simply double if you start, seeing that the migrants are looked after by the contractor, who actually is responsible to the employer, who is the company who makes the houses and things like that. This is something the government has not thought through. Which lobby matters the most? Does the construction lobby matter more, or does the migrant lobby, because they're a vote bank, matter more? Today, the vote bank does not exist for the migrants, and therefore, the burden of my song is threefold. Number one, there ought to be some way of registering every person who comes into a city because the Constitution gives you the right to move, but the Constitution also says there can be reasonable restrictions. One restriction can be you will get registered, but not in an exploitative way, not in a way that you get into more problems, but you at least are a head count. So that policies can be made around different kinds of subgroups which will need to be looked after. To give you slightly a digression, the guards outside the residential colonies have not gone back. They have a job in hand and they know that job will stay. But a lot of the domestic staff and things have simply disappeared. This phenomena will return because the fact is I have already come across, it's anecdotal, but a few people who have come back, but they are frustrated. They said we are not getting what we thought we would get. Not even a quarter of the earnings we had on daily wage are available. Second thing that will have to be done is that in the rural areas, there would have to be, apart from the headcount business, one would have to look at whether it is possible to use the time to certify these people as skilled in one way or the other, because it is with skill that their leverage to be able to get something like a better wage can be negotiated. Today they have, he may be the finest person, but he cannot get any negotiation value, ability. That would have to be factored in, which means the Labour Ministry will have to stop being a regulator. There would have to be somebody who enables this. That kind of an animal has to be either created or this work has to be given to someone at a central and state level. Otherwise, you will find nobody will own this problem. Without ownership, no policy will get made. Nobody is going to make policy out of the blue. Finally, what I want to say is that relating this to the employer is the only sensible way of doing it, but employers are obviously the industry, the medium and small scale industry sector. They're a holy cow right now with the economy's revival being given front, you might say it's on the front burner. So to annoy them by saying that you will have to now look after migrants in a better way is just waving a red rag to the bull. So the question will arise, they will come back, they will need security. If you don't give them security, then you will have a kind of a system which we were having till now, which could explode the second time around if this happens. I don't see a situation where they won't come back. To conclude, I would say they will very much come back once COVID is under control. It is slightly under control in Delhi, and already you see a movement backward in some cases. The construction has not started as yet, but the other softer areas, people are coming back. But politically, unless this is owned, and in a governance framework, unless it is owned, it will still remain what it was pre-COVID, and probably worse, because now they would not get the kind of money they were earning, come what may, for some time to come. Thank you. Hello?
Thank you, Shailaja ji, really for highlighting some of these major policy issues and coming up with very many practical solutions. I entirely agree. The issue is not whether they will come back. The rural-urban inequality and the possibility of creating jobs in the rural sector immediately in the next 6 months or a year would be very, very limited. But the issue is, yes, they would perhaps come back, but are we able to make the cities more inclusive in terms of the policies, programs, and access to the basic amenities? I saw a large number of questions really relating to this specific issue, that are we making the cities more inclusive and just? May I now request Professor Abhay Pethe, is the Professor of Economics in University of Bombay. He's a Senior Resident Fellow, Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy. He's Chair of Development Economics at the University of Bombay, and he has been member of several committees relating to urban development, infrastructural finance, and provision of basic amenities. Well, Abhay, while I wish your city and your state is successful in the next week or so in controlling the spread of the coronavirus. I'm sure we would like to benefit from your views on what's happening in the country, particularly in the state of Maharashtra, which is a state of major concern. Abhay.
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
Thank you, Amitabh and Kirti, for inviting me here. A lot of points have been made with which I broadly agree. As far as, two real things. One, are these guys going to come back? Should they come back? I don't think they have a choice. There is a TINA factor operating, and it makes me uncomfortably sanguine about the possibility that they will be coming back. But as a civilized society, we should not be happy with this. There are a few things we need to do, whether, as Chandraji said, they have the political clout and the lobby to do that. But in any case, we need to, as academics and policymakers, push this agenda. What I'm going to do is really not going to be data-based, as Amitabh would know. I'm going to provide a backdrop of two conceptual frameworks and then talk about what should be done. I mean, I'm going to be able to only flag those issues. The first is my hobby horse, which is the good governance. And I believe that it is the failure of good governance in cities, partly systemic, partly specific, that has led to the problems, including those related to the migrants that we are discussing today. And I agree with Mick that, it is not only important what happens within the cities, but it is important what happens within the cities. So for me, good governance has to have three components. One is the policy framework. If you have policies that are wrong-headed, you are going to get terrible outcomes. So they have to be incentive compatible and they have to be informed by basic economic principles. The processes and protocols, they have to be transactions cost reducing. And the third most important, which is not often highlighted as much as it should, is the capacity, the skills to design, to implement, and the supporting database. We simply did not have the database, so that if we have bad outcomes like what we find with the migrants happening and so on, then we should be able to go back and relocate them in one of the three buckets that I'm talking about of good governance. The migrants' failure that we have is partly due to, and I'm not going to be able to discuss this, though I would love to, is because of the farcical decentralization that has happened with the city government, despite the 74th constitutional amendment, with the farcical treatment of the state finance commissions and all that, and the empowerment. The second conceptual triad that I want to look at, to just flag again, has to do with COVID-19. This is specific. And this has to do with the health risk, with the economic activity, and the human cost. This is the triad that you have to look at. And the migrants problem I locate in the human cost. And there are trade-offs that will have to be worked out within this particular triad also. For example, if you want to take care of migrants through packages, resources will be required, which would be dependent on economic activity, apart from borrowings and all that. Increase in economic activity is going to lead to increase in health risks and increase in cases. And therefore, a fine balance has to be maintained within that. Now, let me turn to specific policy interventions that I would like to suggest. Two quick points. In designing policies, apart from the ones that Shailaja ji talked about, I think incentive compatibility is terribly important, and I keep on returning to that. And secondly, I would think that the lens of livability and livelihoods is a good way of looking at cities. Migrants are not a homogeneous group, we know that, and a lot of the speakers have said this. The commonality is that most of them live in high-density slum-like habitations, which are super spreaders in epidemic times. Fear, vulnerabilities are accentuated, and livability vanishes along with livelihoods. That is the commonality that we have. Let me make it clear that I'm not talking about densities per se, but badly managed systems and crowding that is the culprit here. I say this because I don't want us to be defensive and grant space for anti-urban or anti-agglomeration argument. I strongly believe that India's future is decidedly urban. Now, attract the migrants. Now, I'll just flag some of the things that we can do. One, in the very short run, attract migrants in firefighting mode by free back passage, some payment, relocation allowance, minimum with ration, and people have talked about that. O.P. Agarwal talked about one nation, one kind of amenities, and we are moving toward that with ration cards and such other stuff. Require registration for prospective healthcare provision. All this is implicit in 79 Migrants Workmen's Act. We need to revisit and modify this very important act to suit our times. The problem is, as again was pointed out, it is left with the Labour Department. Labour Department simply does not have the time to look at these things. It is very important that this be decentralized, as some states have done. For example, Gujarat has done this and some others, wherein you allow the professional tax, which as textbook economics tells you is local tax, needs to be given to the local bodies. Once they start doing it, the sales tax guys are not going to be, in the context of GST, PT, professional tax is minuscule, they are not going to be bothered with. So decentralize this generally, and you will be able to get a better handle on registration of migrants and other things. Second thing is, can we have some kind of a security through short-term temporary contracts as a different category in labor? This is a minor labor reform which is already notified in Government of India notifications. States have to accept them. What this means is that the standard thing that we know of contractors kind of exploiting the workers that they get in will not happen. There would be some amount of social security that will be there, and if we have this category, it will be a short-term employment which is on a contract basis, but it does not create a permanent liability for the employer, making his project non-viable. So that is the other thing. The third thing is, can we have MSME empowerment through direct ring-fenced payroll fund injection? And I can go on. I'm going to flag this because being the last, I don't want to overrun the time. Now, in the longer term, one of the things that we need to do has to do with the public health or primary health infrastructure provision. Two important points. One that we always make, that the overall spend on this is horribly low. It needs to double or quadruple. But the capacity to deliver also, to absorb these funds also has to be importantly taken into consideration. But a different point is that governance via management rather than delivery is an important thing. And we might want to learn something from the UK system, where a lot of stuff in public health is done by the private sector. It's only paid by the government. So maybe we should do that rather than trying to deliver all the health components. We don't want public health to deliver private health outcomes. You know, of course, we need to take care of out-of-pocket expenditures, that they don't go up tremendously as they are going up. The second last point that I want to make is to do with public housing and public-private. But what I want to suggest particularly and flag here is the graded rental model. It is important that we have a graded rental model that takes care of all the different segments of the housing market. With the kind of thing that government is doing just for migrants will not work, because there will be a tremendous political pushback. Our Maharashtra Navanirman Sena, the old Shiv Sena, is going to, these guys who come from outside, especially because we have enough vulnerable people in our own country, in our own state, who don't have these provisions. And we need to provide a concept of rental model which requires a revenue model for such models, which requires reform in rental laws, and you see a ultra kind of premium that we are still charging. It requires a proper concept of affordable housing, which is to do with size and basic amenities, especially water and sanitation, which is important to avoid crowding. Again, I'm not talking about densities. Densities can be managed well, So that's not the villain. It's the crowding that is the villain. And Amitabh is chairing this particular session. Amitabh will remember when he was doing the housing shortages thing, we have defined what what an acceptable housing in India is. I think we need to follow up with that. And, pre-independence, it was implicit that industrialists would, in their own pragmatic self-interest, provide rental housing to their workers. That is how the Charles of Mumbai have come up and around the textile mills, etc. So they can walk across, etc. So that is the final point, Amitabh, and that is all of what I'm saying and many more things requires cooperative federalism to function efficiently and completely to the third tier. The packages of central and state governments haven't really been doing too much on this, have to be suitably formulated. This will be conditioned by the comparative importance that a state or the local body gives to remedying the different costs associated, the human cost, the economic activity cost, and the health risk costs. Perhaps partial devolution to the states and from states down to the local, because pandemic is a classic local problem. It's a global problem, but it has one size doesn't fit all. It requires local solutions, and for that you require local empowerment, and for that you require devolution. We know all of this. It is not happening. If we are able to do some of these things, I think the migrants will come, but we will be able to look in their eyes in a better fashion and not feel ashamed the way we are treating them. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhay. You are the last, but never the least. You have come up with very many, very important policy solutions with regard to strengthening the economy, promoting certain specific kind of activities to provide greater access to the migrants, to the labor market, and also providing greater access to the basic amenities, housing, also the cooperatives that you have proposed. I've never seen such a large number of questions coming up after the presentations. That really shows how INHAF has been able to enthuse the researchers and the civil society community. I'm sure the participants have looked at the question box and picked them up, and I think that would be the best way of starting this. And then if I feel that some of the questions have not been picked up, have not been addressed, or some questions if I have, I will raise them. But let's start, the question answer session. I will start the ball rolling by asking Mick. There is a question to you asking whether the commune system in China can help in generating employment in the rural areas and take us to the dream of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India. We have questions from Priyanka, we have questions from Dulal Goldar, we have questions from Sonal Mehta, Ashwini Kumar, and many others. So I'm sure after Mick, anybody who wants to speak can just raise hand and or unmute. Otherwise, keep your things mute, and then you can take your chance for 3 to 5 minutes. Mick, would you like to take up the floor right now?
Okay. The commune system was effectively dismantled, after 1978. So it's something that belongs to the distant past. But I think several people have talked about the way in which you've had very, very spatially polarized processes of development. I think if development were less polarized, then there would be opportunities for people in places that are much closer, if you like, to the places in which they first grow up. And I think that if one pays attention both to creating opportunities in cities and enabling some people to move from rural to urban citizenship, and in moving to urban citizenship, acquire kind of rights that are associated with living in a city. And at the same time, one can improve rural livelihoods. In settlements of a variety of different sizes, one can create a much more equitable pathway towards development.
Thank you, Mick. Would you like to take up any other question or ask anything to the panelists, or you could then?
I'll wait, okay?
Okay.
Well, I'll respond to one question. Someone said, what should one do next time when there is a pandemic of this kind, and when there's a case for restricting people's mobility? In the case of China, because it was Chinese New Year, a lot of people had already were moving, as something that was completely new, in the sense that this virus, was first identified in China, as something that was completely new, was unfolding. But once it was decided that one had to, amongst other things, limit mobility, people who had gone, let's say, to cities such as Wuhan as migrant workers, they had to stay. When they had gone to these cities, if they were working there, they had accommodation. One of the things that's often not mentioned about China's response is that, just to take, where I live, in every community, people in that community were required to visit every single household. And they had to identify, whether that household was in a position to meet its needs in terms of food, in terms of medicines, and so on. And if people were not in a position to do so, people were given the responsibility of helping them with those tasks. Now, because China has a very large communist party, a lot of the people who did that work were people who were members of that party, but also, many other people played an important role in that process. So that's the thing, there's a strong case, for not doing what Ivan said South Africa did. In other words, once the problem was realized, at least to try to, overcome the pandemic, to actually restrict mobility. But if you restrict mobility, you have at the same time, to take action to ensure that you support the livelihoods of everyone. I think that's a very, very important lesson.
Thank you. Dr. Agarwal, you might have noted there are many questions for you in the question box. Would you take your 3 to 5 minutes right now to address some of the questions?
I have actually been trying to answer them by typing the answer. Most of them I have done, except for one question that a lot of the migrants come from Bimaru states and how to alleviate regional economic disparity. This is absolutely right. The Bimaru states really needed to pick up. And the only thing that can be done is really get their economic planning and their development planning going. You can't, I think that's the only way to move forward. I think Rajasthan has moved ahead in many ways. Bihar has moved ahead in some ways. But the only answer is this kind of development. And to me, the starting point of that development is really health and education. I think these are the two sectors where the governments need to invest very strongly, even start looking at health delivery systems. Is the traditional system of having brick and mortar right down to the bottom level the right way of delivering health services? Or are there better ways of delivering health services in a more cost-effective way today? I think that's all I would say. I think the starting point has to be health and education. A lot of it flows after that. But other than that, most of the questions I've been trying to answer here itself. So let me not take up time from others on this.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. Ivan, you have been working on issues of regional disparity in different continents. Would you like to take up this issue of this regional disparity, which is at the root of rural-urban migration, and how that can be addressed, besides any other issue that you pick up from the panelist presentation or the question and answer box? Ivan, take another 3 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think there's no doubt, as Mick said right at the beginning, that the economic arguments for agglomeration are very powerful. But that doesn't mean to say that everything has to be in the big cities. So I think it's a balance is critically important. We need different places have different functions, different roles to play. Secondary cities, smaller towns, they have cost advantages, for example, over big cities, and can perform a different role, complementary role to big cities. So I think we've got to be more sophisticated about how we see the spatial geography of spatial economy of countries. And it's not just either cities or, it's not It's not a simplistic dualism, is a point I'd make about that. The other point I want to make is about what's been exposed very badly in South Africa, and I'm not sure if it's the same in India, I suspect it is the weakness of neighborhood level governance. So, the extreme example would be of a good example, community health workers, right? In countries where they have a very good community health system, Rwanda in Africa is the best example. You've had people on the ground who've been able to keep in touch, do the kind of thing that Mick talked about in Wuhan, keep in contact with families, implement testing, detect early signs of infection. We lack that in South Africa. And as a result, the virus basically spreads in an uncontrolled way. People are not persuaded by government mandates. You must wear a mask, you must practice social distancing. People disregard that. And so you need a kind of capable neighborhood level governance where people trust authority and there's more conviction when advice and guidance is given. That's been a major failure in our poorer communities. People are basically very alienated and don't trust anything government says.
Ivan, if we look at the interstate inequality in India in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we find that regional inequality, interstate inequality has been going up. But from 2004-5 onwards, you do find many of these backward states, including the Bimaru state, as we say, 6 states, have shown significant acceleration in their growth rate. But yet we do find that rural-urban migration and the migration across the states have not gone down. Rural-urban inequality has sharpened up to at least 2014-15 or 16-17 that we have the data, but certainly rural-urban migration has not really slowed down. So I was just wondering that the regional development issues besides that, could there be some other measures, because migration is inevitable. North-south divide in terms of demographic patterns of growth is significant. Total fertility rate in the southern states is already 2.1, whereas the northern states have a high fertility rate. Labor force is growing at a much faster rate. Perhaps I'm not asking you to answer that, but this is certainly an important question. If you have something to say on that, or I would ask Ravi Srivastava to just take this up. Would you like
just a quick point. I think the issue of choice is fundamentally important. Government, ultimately people must decide where they're going to be better off. And there are social networks, people know where they're going to be better off. One has to trust those and to some extent follow and anticipate those kind of processes. I don't think government can control and restrict in the way it has in a number of countries, particularly in Asia and historically in South Africa. That is very divisive, very, very damaging.
That's absolutely correct. Ravi, looking at the fact that the growth of labor force in many of the northern states is very high, whereas in many of the southern states, the labor force growth is much lower. How do you look at the interstate migration, and also given the rural-urban inequality sharpening in terms of many of the middle quality services? How do you think we should address this issue? Ravi, take your 5 minutes.
Yeah, so Amitabh, in fact, we've recently done a very extensive report which looks precisely at these two issues, which looks at the impact of the differential growth of labor force across states and the differential economic growth as two major drivers of interstate, the pattern of interstate migration in India. And both, certainly, if you look at it, and you can see that the deficits in labor force in the southern states and so on are very marked. So certainly this is an important driver along with other drivers of the pattern of labor migration in India today. But I do want to point out that the pattern of interstate development that we see today is policy driven. It's very much a product of the kind of policies that we've had since liberalization and, since liberalization in the 90s. And I also want to say, partly in response to what Ivan said, that although agglomeration is important, it has become less important in determining the spatial dynamics of growth in the last 2 or 3 decades because of all kinds of things. Post-Fordist production, technology of production has changed a great deal in the past 2 to 3 decades. And that means that we can look at much more decentralized production, and the spatial production patterns can be quite different, provided there is a policy space, the correct kind of policy space is there, correct kind of incentives are there. So I think we do need to reimagine the development paradigm which we've had, which has promoted unequal development. And I think this is part not only of an Indian development paradigm, but also globally also we need to think very deeply about these issues. If I can just take 1 or 2 minutes, because there were 2 questions specifically addressed to me in the question box. One was about rental housing. As you know, till about a decade ago or a little more than a decade ago, I was mainly a ruralist, working mainly on issues of rural transformation. It's only the last 10 years that I've dabbled with industry and urban issues. And I know that the extent to which employers and the state have withdrawn from housing for workers in India is remarkable. So what you have is either you have 3 sets of laws in India, the Contract Labor Act, the Building and Worker Construction Act, and the ISMW, where contractors are supposed to take care of housing, not employers, but contractors are supposed to take care of housing for workers, or there is nothing. And that vacant space has now been populated by private, private rentiers of all kinds, including labor contractors themselves. So this is an area which I think an organization like INHAF needs to do much more evidence policy building. What kind of rental housing policy do we need in India? And that's very important. The second question which I was asked about is how will things change now that migrants are coming back with the kind of experience that they've had over the last few months? I'm one of those who believe that it will change. It has changed. Migrants will no longer be able to submit themselves to the same kind of labor regimes as they were subjected to till a few months ago in India, the circular migrants. And I think this is also because a large number of civil society organizations have intervened on their behalf in the last few months and have gained experience, have learned a great deal about them. And I'm very hopeful that in the months to come, the employers and the state, and this is also, partly answering Shailaja's, premise, will have to reckon with the fact that the migrants are no longer the same as they were a few months ago. And policies, with the cusp of policy change in China after the 12th Party Congress mainly. And they've had a few years of decades of experience now in dealing with migration and handling policy. We have not even begun there. I hope we can begin there now with the kind of lessons that we've learned from the pandemic and what we've seen of the migrants' experience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ravi. Shailaja ji, you can pick up the questions for you from the Q&A box, but I have 1 or 2 small issues that I thought you are the best person to answer. One question that was put to the panelist, not specifically to you, but I think you could try to answer that. That's this digital education that started, how it's going to sharpen the inequality in this country, because in the rural areas, even in within the large cities, there is a section of the population that children are not having access to that. How do you think this issue would be addressed? The second question that I would specifically like you to comment on is that you have talked about registration of the migrants to make the cities more inclusive. Let there be, stronger legislation, portability, and all that Dr. Agarwal also mentioned. But if you look at the 1979 Interstate Migration Act, and many of the states have some kind of a modified version of that, there are studies which show that the requirement for employing the interstate migrant workers were expensive. And that really made the industrialists, private sector, avoid the interstate migrants, because the compliance to health provisions, housing provisions really made them very expensive. And many of the interstate migrants were willing to work without those provisions, and they offered themselves. So I was just wondering that any kind of a legislation, strengthening of this Interstate Migration Act, I hope they do not become exclusionary. Instead of helping the migrants, it doesn't really make their position worse in the labor market. Could you comment on this, please? And take 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you've raised something which is extremely important and practical. My practical wisdom tells me that it will not be easy to implement any kind of registration or making it the responsibility of somebody to implement those laws and see them through. It's very clear that the industry and the manufacturing is something that India will pay much more attention to. How it gets done will be always something which will be attended to, but not with the same spirit as the, the manufacturing and the growth and the export potential, which needs to be revved up. So I would say that the migrants will not get the benefit of this unless it becomes a political issue. It is not a political issue, and the migrants don't have any leverage at all at this moment. As I said earlier, they do not come with any particular background. You have migrants here from Bihar, some are from Chhapra, some are from Darbhanga, some have, they immediately said, we are not this caste, we are that caste. They are already ridden by their own caste, equations. So I would say that I don't see those acts being adopted and enacted as though that is the most important concern. But as a ex-policymaker, I would say that it would be retrograde on us part if we ignore it just in the name of the growth of the economy, because you're really being highly exploitative and you're playing into the hands. It's like saying you can go on extracting any amount of groundwater. It doesn't matter because you need that industry to run, you need agriculture to run. It doesn't matter what happens to the natural resource, but it is a criminal act. So this is also criminal, but can very easily get sidelined in the totality of the priorities of governments, of industry, of people who are going to make the growth picture improve. And today the growth has overtaken all other considerations. I think the migrants will not really come back in the same way. Mentally, they are upset, they're angry. I know of a guy who comes from Sundarbans in West Bengal. I'm just giving you the examples so you know how pathetic it is. The man was washing 40 cars every day, getting paid 400 rupees a car for a month, 400. He then worked in 2 houses as a cook. He also looked after some elderly people whose children were abroad and earned money. So he was really working 18 hours a day. He now says that he got COVID. He was asymptomatic because he got it from his owner, whoever he was working for, who got COVID. He was put into his house with an infant and his wife and not allowed to move out. The water was placed outside his door. He was not allowed to come out. So I asked him, I can talk to somebody in the municipal corporation or in the police or in the district magistrate's office because this is not right. They can't prevent you from coming out of your house. He said, please don't do that because they will slam my scooter. They'll do something to my child. At night, if I get a chance, I'm going back to the Sundarbans. And he did that. He disappeared. So the public pressure also is not in their favor. The surrounding people who are themselves once migrants are more concerned about their welfare than the welfare of the so-called newer group of migrants. So even within migrants, there are hierarchies. I don't think it's a simple issue. All I can say is that the economy will demand that they need labor. Willy-nilly, the same people may not come back to the same jobs, but another set of people will fill that vacuum. That is bound to happen. It is for people like us around the table, people like civil society organizations, to keep this on the front burner, that exploitation will not be tolerated. And you need data. Without data, you are nowhere. And I don't think we have the breakup sectorally as much as we should have had.
Thank you, Shailaja ji, for providing this perspective, also bringing out some of these micro-level evidences and underlining the need for better quality data. Abhay, I thought there were questions about housing. You are the best person to answer that, although some answers have come up. If you look at Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, People have talked about, yes, could we not have provided houses for the interstate migrants so that they wouldn't have been thrown out of their houses by their landlords? But if you look at the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana's 4 component, you do find that the least amount of resource allocation has taken place for in situ slum upgradation. And original proposal was 90% of the houses will be constructed for these slum dwellers, and that has got the lowest priority. And I did a quick benefit cost analysis. The social rate of return in investing in slum housing and providing access to the poorest and the migrant population would be very high compared to the other components like affordable housing, public-private partnership, or beneficiary linked things. How do you look at this housing scenario, and how do you think that the interventions in the housing sector can make it a little more pro-poor? Because I believe that PMAY will certainly achieve the total targets of 11 million houses for the urban areas, but they are not going to reach the poorest sections and the vulnerable sections. So Abhay, would you like to say something on this quickly in 2-3 minutes?
Well, I would like to just say this, that, this housing business, we are still trying to do the Antyodaya, and that is prone to elite capture. So my suggestion would be that look at housing sector in an integrated fashion. Don't look at it in segmented just for the poor, slightly less poor and all that, because there is elite capture that happens, and we have seen that in SRA kind of stuff and so on. As far as the in situ development of slums are concerned, I think that is the only thing we can really do, and that can be done with the help of, if we had proper decentralization, made it into a political thing at the local level, then along with the civil society organizations, we will be able to have the fund flows coming to that, and that can be done. I think that is the one thing that can be done immediately. The second thing is, I go back to improving and reforming the whole DCR and the BCRs and the rent control in Maharashtra and Mumbai that we have, because that has completely killed off the rental market, which means that the old sites and services program, which was a success story, is no more available to us. And poor people or even lower middle class with the kind of reality in Mumbai simply can't afford to own houses. And therefore, if we don't have contract enforcement, and if we don't have proper incentive compatible reformed housing sector regulations, you're not going to make a headway. The best headway is in situ development and then rental, and graded rental, because it has to be done for the entire housing society segment, except for the richest, which doesn't matter anyway. So I think if we try to do it in a segmented fashion, we are bound to fail because of the political economy and the elite capture. We don't have the capacity to implement, the rules that we might create. Amitabh, can I have just 1 minute more?
Please go ahead.
On a different issue, because since there is we talked about the regional imbalance and so on, and Ravi talked about it in great detail. I want to just flag an issue that if you look at the overall data, there post 2005, last 10, 15 years, there is some amount of convergence, at least in econometric sense, in terms of the states that are performing. But what has happened is, just as we say that the story of India is now story of the states, now the story of inequality and interregional imbalances has become an intra-state story. And maybe if we focused more on that, and I come from Maharashtra, where we had the constitutional amendment 371-2, wherein we had a special status for a particular region in Maharashtra, and I happen to be a member of the Vijay Kerkar committee, and we think we gave a very good report of how to exploit the comparative advantages of different regions so that there is accelerated development and growth. Unfortunately, that is just lying and eating dust. The second thing is that I agree that agglomeration of one city may not be the issue. And there should be greater uniform distribution, etc. What I suspect is, and that is another hobby horse of mine, if you look at growth in India, the growth polls overwhelmingly are in metropolitan regions. This is a missing chapter in India's urbanization. The metropolitan governance and how do we do that? Not in the development authority setting up MMRDAs and DDAs and all that, but having a metropolitan level governance is very, very important. These are the 2 points I wanted to make, which are slightly contrarian, because everybody seems to be agreeing with everybody else on this panel. Not a very nice thing.
Thank you, Abhay. I think this is a very, very important point that you made, and we can certainly take this up. We are coming to the end of the webinar. We started asking this question that how do we make our cities more inclusive, more just, and when the migrants come back, and they would, and not because we have made the cities much better, but they would do that because of the economic compulsions, which is understandable. But there are two issues that I would like to bring in, particularly Dr. Agarwal and Ivan and other panelists also, that, what have we done to the labor market? What are the changes that have come up in the last 3 to 4 months? And what are the changes that are being proposed in the labor market to make the migrant workers, strengthen their capacity to bargain or to have a better kind of a deal in the labor market? And second is about this access to basic amenities. Now, my quick review tells me that Uttar Pradesh has gone for massive labor reform in order to promote the economic activities. I know they're trying to promote labor intensive industries, but nonetheless, the various labor laws, excepting some about the equality, gender equality and minimum wages, they're being relaxed. The Companies Act have been to a certain extent relaxed. The hours of work, the powers of the trade unions, there have been curbing, and similar things are happening. Let's keep this out of politics. In Rajasthan, this has happened. In Madhya Pradesh, this has happened. In, various other states, you do find that the hours of work has gone up, taken up, without being an additional compensation. The payment for the additional hours would be the similar things. Now, this is one issue. Do we think that we need to take stock at those changes? Because there is a court case which showed that any such decisions on the ordinance which are passed should be subject to judicial review. While I understand the need for those labor reforms to promote the economy and labor intensive growth, where have we the benefits that in the labor market the long struggle has brought in? Are we at the verge of sacrificing them, and that may happen unless we have a review? That is one thing. And second point, I would like to say that you have taken a position, Abhay, and many others also, that you cannot reach the
I think we lost,
Amitabh.
Must be an electricity, shutdown. Yeah. I think Kirti or somebody will have to just take over. Let's see if he can come back.
Yes, I think we have lost Professor Kundu due to electricity issues.
Yes, must be.
He was addressing Dr. Agarwal, I guess. If Dr. Agarwal can take over. You are muted.
I am really not the best person to talk about this. Honestly, I would say Mrs. Shailaja Chandra is much better placed than me to say about it. But there is something else I would like to speak about, which I can do later, something that Evan and Ravi, Dr. Ravi Srivastava brought up, something on that. But I'll do it whenever you permit me to do that. On the labor reforms, frankly, I don't have the competence.
Gentleman, will you like to say something?
Shall I just say something about one reform here? Okay. Well, Amitabh,
I'm so sorry that there was some problem at our end. So I would like the second question, let me complete that. There is a position taken that you cannot reach the poorest section unless you produce enough to satisfy the middle class. Without doing that, you cannot reach the poor. By administrative or legal actions, you cannot really target to the poorest section unless the volume of production is very high. And that's what has happened in the housing sector. The poor are not getting it. Is that the position taken? I would, Ivan, would you like to take up the floor right now? Yeah.
Thanks very much. Just when I think about your second question, I think on the first question about trade unions and the pressure to deregulate, there is undoubtedly pressure from business now to, if you like, take advantage of the crisis and press for reforms. But trade unions in South Africa are very strong and are likely to resist any efforts at deregulation. But that's a positive feature in terms of protecting workers' rights, but it has a downside in that there are insiders and outsiders in the labor market. And the trade unions are good at protecting the position of existing workers, but the trade unions are not very generous in relation to informal workers and unemployed people. So we have a two-speed labor market, and that's a massive issue, of course, with so many people unemployed, beyond the reach of trade unions and concerns about worker rights. I think in terms of helping the poor, I think government has done the basics in terms of, looking back, protecting poor people without work with a kind of minimal welfare system, right? It's not a generous system, but there are grants that prevent desperate extreme poverty. We have that system in South Africa. It's really been put under enormous pressure with the current crisis, and more people are going hungry, but we don't see the kind of extreme chronic poverty that you see in many other African countries because of this basic social protection system.
Thank you, Ivan. Dr. Agarwal, would you like to come in quickly? I know you have to leave at 7.
I will leave in 5 minutes. No, what I was saying is that, on the labor market issue, frankly, I don't have the competence to really comment on that. Mr. Shailaja Chandra would be much better informed of that. But on this housing issue, I think the problem is you have a lot of middle-class housing that is available and empty. So it's not really a volume issue. The volumes are there and many of them are empty. I think the problem there is the rental, the rent control legislation.
Dr. Agarwal, just 1 minute. Our committee noted that there are shortage of 11 or 12 million, but there are 9 million houses in the urban areas already vacant, That's it.
So this is the issue. We have to resolve this issue. But Amitabh, I just wanted to say one other small thing about, if you permit me now,
please.
Something that Ivan and Dr. Ravi Srivastava also brought up, this whole issue of agglomeration economies. I think I take a bit of a position that is in between what they said. I don't think there is a getting away from agglomeration economies. But what is the threshold level for that agglomeration? And to my mind, the threshold level will be different for different kinds of services. Is it possible for us to think of what is the economy of scale that is right for a different kind of service, and think of a city architecture that is somewhat close to what Dr. Ravi Srivastava said, of some things that is slightly more spread out with good connectivity between those agglomerations, but you don't need very high level of densities for everything. And there is the upper side of that bound is there a capacity constraint? What are the capacity limits for this agglomeration? I don't think we've done enough work to find out these upper and lower bounds for the different kind of services that a city provides. This is something that needs to be done. Let me leave it at that. If you permit, let me run off now. I have to really join my other call.
But we are concluding in any case.
I'll wait.
Get two, 3 more comments. Okay. Ravi, would you like to come in quickly now before I ask Shailaja and also make some observations on this issue? Ravi?
No, I think I've said it's okay. I think Shailaja can come in.
But you're saying, okay. Yeah. Ravi.
No, I leave it to Shailaja ji now to make. I'm okay. No last comments.
Okay, no, but you have 1 minute. Final, if you have.
No, I think, a lot of the observations which have been made, which really don't, the whole, when you look at the issue around migrants, the whole issue is, it's basically issue of citizenship. To my mind, this is the most critical issue. It's a question of how do you entitle a group of people to the rights which are there for them in the Constitution. And I think we have to take this very seriously. And give visibility to citizens who are really outside the ambit of as it were the Constitution, who are excluded, because we cannot hope to reach whatever development goals we talk about, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's decent work. The numbers are so large that unless we visualize this and deal with this in a concerted fashion and policy, then we should just forget about our development goals and objectives.
Thank you, Ravi. Shailaja ji, given the power structure, elite capture, and the powerful middle class vested interest, you think it is possible to target certain facilities to the poor in a manner that the benefits go directly to them? What is your opinion? Can you?
It is possible. It is more than possible. COVID has shown us that when containment zones had to be made, it was possible to actually go down to households and to whole rows of houses and say, this is a containment zone. To give you a slightly more, I would say, a slightly positive story, I live in an upmarket colony in Delhi. It is surrounded by very poor slums. The slum dwellers from 5 different kind of slum groups service these colonies and the offices which are nearby. We all pay much, much less, and we are all exploitative, because I know my daughter came and said, this guy has been in your house for the last 6 hours, and how many more hours are you going to keep him? These are not questions which we even think of. We just pay for a job and we say it has to be done. The positive story that I want to, it can be extrapolated. The Resident Welfare Association of my colony, which is the Vasant Vihar colony, is surrounded by poor and middle class colonies, which are really slums, and people who are at the lowest end, like guards and drivers, who are living in a slightly better accommodation, but called Vasant Gaon. You also have the Air India colony, the lower end, not the officer end, the CPWD colony, that is Public Works Department, the lower end. Now, the Resident Welfare Association of Vasant Vihar, a very high-end colony, has begun accumulating the data for all these satellite places as far as COVID cases go. How many are quarantined? How many are under home quarantine? How many have recovered? How many have been hospitalized? And where have they been hospitalized? So in a way, it is the health issue of my welfare that has made it incumbent on me to look at the health of people whom I didn't care about earlier. The Resident Welfare Association has suddenly begun to realize that if they have cases there, it's going to affect us. So we better keep track of them. It is that extrapolation of this example, which is what will make it possible for more interest to be taken at a highly decentralized level for the surrounding, you might say, satellites of poor people who surround and service either a commercial district or a residential area. I think that can evolve, but there has to be a pivot, and that pivot here has been COVID. There would probably have to be another pivot by which this is going to be, there'll be an oversight which is necessary. Without the oversight and the push, it's not going to happen. But it happened for COVID, so it is more than possible, to answer your question, to actually map it out and do it.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, somebody has said, a poet in Bengal, that COVID is socialistic as far as it has this fear that it has spread across the different income categories. I just can mention that in Vasant Kunj area, which is the steppe sister of Vasant Vihar area. There were 2 days of water shortage, and we managed to get few thousand gallons of water. And when I said that 10% of it should go to the slum areas, people said, protested, we want them to get water, but not from our share. You know, I think health issues, you're right, that unites the interest. But on the access to basic amenities, the things are difficult. Mick, would you like to say something in the last moment? Mick, are you there? Yeah. You have to unmute yourself.
I've unmuted myself.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. 1 minute.
3 quick points. I mean, in China, there was also an issue of empty housing. In relation to that issue, it was interesting that Xi Jinping said houses are built to be lived in, not for speculation. So I think, you know, the issue is not simply a question of rents, it's also a question of speculation. As far as employment issues are concerned, the government or the state can legislate. And one very, very important measure that Amitabh mentioned to me this morning that was adopted in China in January this year and came into effect on the 1st of March deals with the fact that many migrant workers are actually not paid wages by their employers.
Right.
So to address that issue, you know, a set of provisions have been put in place under which anyone who is not paid can approach the public authorities, and then they will then require that employer to pay that sum of money within a specified period of time. If they fail to pay within that specified period of time, the salary will be doubled or trebled. Beyond that, legal procedures can be adopted against any employer who after that period of time fails to make these payments. And also, you know, responsibility for paying has been made the responsibility of the prime contractor. So where there are subcontractors, you cannot pass down responsibility for paying wages lower down the chain. So these are measures that can make a significant difference, you know, to the position of many migrant workers, you know, who in the past have confronted this problem of not being paid for the work that they have done. And the last point I wanted to make is about the question as to whether you can target the poor. I mean, I think it's absolutely clear. I mean, if you look at the current poverty alleviation program in China, that you can target resources at the poor if the government has the determination, you know, to put people first.
Thank you, Mick. I have absolutely no intention at this time to take my 5 minutes trying to summarize this rich discussion. I would like to conclude, but certainly I would like to give 1 minute to my friend Abhay Pethe. He said he's the last person. Abhay, you have your last word for this webinar. Where are you?
Yeah, okay. Just 2 things. When I said that it can't be done today, I meant I was reading the current political economy and our capacity. Of course, it can be done logically, and in certain services, it can definitely be done. And the second thing is, my mantra for improvement in urban governance and other things is, for heaven's sake, please decentralize in the letter and spirit of 74th Constitutional Amendment. That's all. Then we can tackle these problems locally much better and improve our capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, friends. I must say that this has been one of the very successful webinars that I have been associated with in the last 3 months. And that's basically because of the cooperation and a very sharply focused presentation and the question answer session that we have had. I would like to thank each and every panelist really to bring a lot of critical data and also the perspective for solution, for consideration. I'm sure the issues will be deliberated by them individually and will be taken to the collective forums. I'm really grateful to INHAF, particularly Mr. Kirti Shah, for really inspiring us to take up this event. If Sharad is here, maybe he can conclude by thanking the panelists and also the anchor. Sharad or Kirti Shah, but if they're not here, well, in that case, we can, I can once again, all of you.
Hello,
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sharad, yeah.
Sharad,
sorry,
we have been waiting for you.
Yeah, there was a mistake. I couldn't join in the beginning, but wonderfully handled. Each participant really contributed a lot, and it added to my knowledge. And I really thank Amitabh for handling it very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharad and INHAF.